The trenches of 1916 smelled of cordite, blood, and a stubborn kind of mud that would not let men go. Soldiers crawled through rat-lined galleries and climbed out into no man's land, only to find lines of rifles fixed and waiting. Firepower had been concentrated into stationary emplacements and heavy machine guns. Mobility was slow, measured, and paid for in lives. John Moses Browning watched photographs of those fields and listened to the complaints of officers who could not storm a position without being cut to pieces. He believed there was another way, a weapon that put automatic fire into the hands of advancing infantry, not just into the bunkers. He called the tactic it would enable walking fire. Move forward under your own suppressive fire so the enemy could not pick you off while you closed the distance. Browning's idea was audacious because it required rethinking the relationship between the individual rifleman and the machine gun. Heavy machine guns provided streams of bullets but anchored units. Rifles provided precision but demanded exposure. The BAR, Browning Automatic Rifle, was meant to sit between these extremes. Chambered for the U.S. Army's workhorse cartridge, the .30-06, the BAR would be lighter than a tripod gun, heavy enough to deliver controlled automatic bursts, and robust enough to work from the shoulder or hip while troops moved. It was a compromise and a promise. Give a squad a man who could lay down continuous fire while he advanced, and the squad could close, assault, and seize ground. The first prototypes were blunt instruments. Browning favored a short, stout profile, a 20-pound package by modern standards, but revolutionary when compared to an immobile machine gun. The firearm's length and weight were deliberate. It absorbed the recoil of the powerful .30-06 cartridge and permitted a degree of control in automatic fire that lighter weapons lacked. Early testers found the BAR's balance odd, too heavy for a rifleman to march with all day, too light to anchor like an MG-08, but that middle ground was precisely its virtue. Engineers at the time argued over barrels and cooling systems, over whether a fixed barrel with a limited rate of fire could survive the heat of sustained use. Browning answered with simplicity: make it durable, make it reliable, and teach soldiers to use it not as a sustained fire machine gun, but as a moving support weapon. Doctrine lagged behind invention. Military thinkers in Europe had long assumed that automatic fire belonged to the crew-served weapon. The idea of a single soldier sweeping the ground with bursts as he walked toward an objective sounded almost theatrical, yet it was intensely practical. Walking fire required training, coordination, and restraint. The barman could not simply hose a field with continuous rounds. He had to time bursts to shield the team's advance, to suppress the heads that would peek over parapets, to keep the enemy's rifles down long enough for riflemen to move from cover to cover. Units that learned this rhythm changed how they attacked, not in brittle lines, but in rolling waves, each wave supported by a human machine laying down a moving curtain. Between the wars, the BAR's critics kept tally of its faults: weight, the awkward bipod that added bulk, limited magazine capacity compared with belt-fed guns, but the proponents, small unit tacticians and experimental officers who had studied World War I's failures, saw its promise. Workshops refined the stock and the sights. Ordnance officers found ways to harden the receiver and reduce the likelihood of cook-offs during the short, brutal bursts that walking fire called for. Training manuals began to include drills that emphasized movement under fire, bursts of covering fire synchronized with creeping advances, and the importance of the barman's place in the fire team. Where before an assault might wait for artillery, infantry with bar support could advance on a suppressed trench, reach it, and clear it with grenades and bayonets while the bar provided the necessary margin of safety. The concept reshaped small unit composition. Instead of massing multiple riflemen to produce the volume of fire once supplied by a single machine gun crew, American squads began to allocate a dedicated automatic weapon and the men to support it, a barman, an assistant to change magazines and spot targets, and riflemen trained to move with the rhythm of bursts. The resulting formation was more flexible than a heavy machine gun team and more lethal in movement than a line of bolt-action rifles. Tactical experimentation and training camps produced doctrine notes. Always pair the bar with maneuver, never allow it to be isolated. Use it to fix the enemy, then let riflemen exploit the opportunity. The proof of concept came not in parades or papers, but on battlefields where mobility mattered. When the first bars arrived at the front in limited numbers, commanders noticed how a single automatic weapon, carried by a squad, could blunt a counterattack or keep heads down while engineers cleared obstacles. Tactical memoirs from men who would later fight in World War II speak of the bar as a psychological lever as much as a physical one. Its report changed the rhythm of an advance, made defenders hesitate, and gave attacking units permission to move. That hesitation, a fraction of a second, repeated across a squad, became the difference between a stalled assault and a captured trench. John Browning had not merely invented a gun, he had sculpted an idea into iron and wood. The bar's existence demanded new drills, new trust between comrades, and a willingness to let fire and movement live in the same breathing space. In doing so, it anticipated the modern squad automatic weapon and rewired how infantry thought about assault. The walking fire was more than a tactic, it was a philosophy that put suppression and momentum at the center of small unit success, a philosophy the bar would test, refine, and prove in the wars to come.
When the guns of World War I finally fell silent, the Browning automatic rifle, the weapon John Browning had built for the last push across the trenches, stood at an uncertain crossroads. It had entered combat too late to decide the war, but early enough to prove that the concept worked. In France, soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force, who had carried it into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, remembered it with a mix of awe and exhaustion. They called it the light machine gun you could trust. And in an age when most guns jammed after a handful of rounds, that was the highest praise imaginable. But with peace came budgets, bureaucracy, and skepticism. For the U.S. Army, the question after 1918 was not whether the BAR worked, but whether the idea of the BAR fit into the future of war. America, like most nations, demobilized and forgot. The great armies of Europe packed their machine guns in Greece and sent their automatic rifles to storage. The world called it the war to end all wars, and the weapons of that war, it was assumed, had already reached their limit. Yet in a handful of ordnance departments, men who had seen the trench carnage firsthand refused to let Browning's invention fade. They knew that the next war would move faster, hit harder, and reward mobility. The original BAR, M1918, had been simple: a 20-round magazine, a fixed barrel, a cyclic rate around 500 rounds per minute. It lacked quick-change barrels and could overheat after sustained fire, but its balance of weight and power made it a hybrid weapon unlike anything else. Through the 1920s, engineers at Springfield Armory began experimenting with improvements. They tried adding bipods, flash suppressors, and adjustable fire rates. The interwar years saw a slow transformation, both mechanical and philosophical. By 1932, tests had led to the M1918A1, and later, in 1938, the definitive M1918A2, the version that would march across Europe and the Pacific. This new BAR was heavier, sturdier, and tailored for squad use rather than walking fire. It featured two selectable rates of fire: a slow mode, around 350 rounds per minute, for controlled bursts, and a fast mode, around 550 to 600, for suppression. The addition of a bipod at the muzzle and a steel buttplate shoulder rest allowed gunners to fire from prone positions with stability. The weapon had matured from an individual assault tool into the beating heart of a small fire team. Yet doctrine had not caught up. In the 1920s and early 1930s, American infantry tactics were conservative, still shaped by the ghosts of the trenches. Manuals instructed riflemen to rely on bolt-action Springfields for accuracy and save automatic fire for emergencies. The idea of walking fire, men advancing under their own bursts, remained controversial. Critics argued that soldiers carrying heavy weapons would waste ammunition and lose accuracy. They were not entirely wrong. Early training footage showed recruits stumbling forward, firing from the hip with clouds of dirt and noise, but little effect. But in the right hands, with practiced timing and discipline, the concept could turn a squad into a moving storm. At Fort Benning, where the U.S. Infantry School trained future commanders, new instructors began quietly reshaping doctrine. They studied reports from French and British experiments and from the U.S. Marine Corps, which had used BARs in the Banana Wars in Central America. Those jungle skirmishes proved that a single automatic rifle could dominate a fight if supported by riflemen who understood its rhythm. By the mid-1930s, training emphasized coordination. One BAR team laying suppressive fire, while another element flanked, then switching roles in a continuous dance of movement and fire. The weapon's role in the squad became codified. One BAR per 9-man rifle squad, with the automatic rifleman as the unit's anchor. The doctrine was simple. The BAR pinned the enemy, the rifleman maneuvered to kill him. The assistant gunner carried spare magazines, the team leader directed bursts, and the rest of the squad advanced in rhythm. This was a radical shift from static trench warfare to dynamic fire and maneuver tactics, a philosophy that would define every American infantry action of World War II. But the path from paper to practice was uneven. Training ammunition was scarce, budgets tighter still. Soldiers often drilled with wooden mock-ups, practicing magazine changes and prone firing positions on dusty parade fields. Real automatic fire was reserved for demonstrations and qualification ranges. The few who had fired the BAR in live exercises became instant teachers to others. They learned its quirks, how to rest the bipod on soft soil without burying it, how to fire short 2 to 4 round bursts to avoid overheating, how to brace the recoil by leaning forward instead of letting the gun pull them back. Despite its weight, nearly 20 pounds loaded, the BAR earned affection. Soldiers called it the Beast, sometimes the Mule, but always with respect. It kicked hard but never betrayed its shooter. The simple gas-operated mechanism rarely jammed. The bolt cycled with a deep, steady rhythm that every man in the squad could recognize by sound alone. That rhythm became the heartbeat of the platoon. Across the ocean, other armies took note. German officers studied the BAR's battlefield reports with professional interest. Their own light machine gun doctrine, which would culminate in the MG-34 and MG-42, owed something to the same insight Browning had reached decades earlier, that small, mobile units needed internal automatic firepower. But the Americans stuck with the BAR not out of inertia, but conviction. It was heavy, yes, but it was human-sized. One man, one weapon, moving with the squad. By 1939, as war returned to Europe, American infantry manuals began to echo the lessons Browning had built into his weapon. Phrases like marching fire, covering advance, and organic automatic support appeared in training documents. Photographs from Louisiana maneuvers showed squads advancing through forests, BARs blazing in short, precise bursts. The idea of walking fire had evolved. It was no longer about a single soldier striding upright through bullets, but about a squad moving forward as one living organism, each man covering the other's step. That doctrine, born in Browning's imagination and refined through 20 years of testing and argument, would soon meet its trial by fire. When the U.S. entered World War II, the BAR was no longer an experiment or a relic. It was the centerpiece of the infantry squad, the bridge between rifle and machine gun, between motion and suppression. The lessons learned in the quiet years, the rhythm of bursts, the trust between gunner and rifleman, the art of advancing through fire, would soon be tested in the fields of Normandy, the jungles of the Pacific, and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And in those battles, the world would finally see what John Browning had meant all along. That sometimes victory didn't come from standing firm, but from walking forward while the gun was still firing.
When the ramp of the landing craft dropped on the beaches of Normandy, the theory of walking fire ceased to be words in a manual. It became survival. In the chaos of June 6, 1944, amid surf and smoke, mud and machine gun tracers, the Browning automatic rifle found its true voice. The men who carried it, the barmen, were often the first to fire and the last to stop. To them, it was not a concept. It was the difference between being pinned down and pushing forward. The beaches of Omaha and Utah were killing grounds, where movement seemed impossible. German MG-42s, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, tore through landing waves like scythes. Riflemen barely made it off the sand. But the barmen, crawling behind chunks of steel obstacles and bodies, began to answer. One private from the 1st Infantry Division remembered watching his squad's bar open up, its heavy, slow thunder cutting between the shrill German bursts. The MG-42 was like ripping cloth, he said, but the bar, it was like a drumbeat, steady and deep. It gave you courage just hearing it. From behind seawalls and shallow craters, bars laid down covering fire while engineers blew gaps through the wire. The weapon's bipods sank into sand, but held steady enough for bursts, 3, 4, 5 rounds, that forced the German gunners to duck for precious seconds. That sliver of time let others crawl forward. A few meters here, a few there, this was how the Americans clawed their way off the beach. The walking fire had evolved. Now it was crawling, firing, and crawling again. But the principle was the same. Move while you shoot. Never stop suppressing. Never give the enemy back his freedom to look up. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the bar reached near mythic status. The bocage was a sniper's paradise, narrow lanes bordered by earthen walls and tangled roots that turned every field into a fortress. Tanks could not maneuver. Mortars were unreliable in the close quarters. The barman became the squad's hammer. He fired through gaps in the hedges, laying down bursts that pinned unseen Germans on the other side, while his comrades slipped around to flank. Its .30-06 rounds smashed through foliage, branches, and light cover with punishing force. You could hear it chewing the hedges, one sergeant recalled. You didn't need to see the enemy, you just needed to make him afraid to breathe. Each squad guarded its bar like a talisman. The gunner often carried extra weight, 20 magazines, sometimes more, plus the weapon's 20-pound bulk, but he also carried the squad's confidence. As long as the bar was firing, you felt like you had a chance, wrote a corporal from the 29th Infantry Division. When it fell silent, everyone's heart stopped. That's why assistants hovered close, feeding magazines, tapping shoulders when it was time to reload, spotting targets through the smoke. The weapon was no longer just a tool, it was the squad's pulse. In Italy, amid the crumbling stone villages and steep hillsides of Salerno, Cassino, and Anzio, the bar's blend of portability and firepower proved indispensable. Streets barely wide enough for a jeep became canyons of echoing gunfire. German machine guns were dug into second-story windows in church towers, and snipers waited in bell towers or rubble. Riflemen could not suppress them. They needed something heavier. But the heavy Brownings, M1919s, were too cumbersome for the twisting lanes. So the bars moved forward. Firing from behind corners, over walls, through broken doorways, the barmen became the spearheads of street combat. One after-action report from Casino told of a single bar team holding an entire intersection for nearly 2 hours against repeated German counterattacks. The gunner, crouched behind a destroyed cart, alternated between short bursts and controlled fire, using every magazine until his assistant fetched more under mortar smoke. When reinforcements arrived, they found the street littered with shell casings and German helmets. The report said the gun was smoking like a forge. He didn't let them breathe. Even in mountainous terrain, where everything was vertical and every shot echoed through valleys, the bar gave infantrymen autonomy. It was their artillery when they had none. The weapon's stability in prone fire made it ideal for holding ridgelines or covering retreats. The men learned to love its rhythm, that solid chug-chug-chug that cut through the whine of incoming shells and the screams of ricochets. For many, that sound became the heartbeat of survival. Half a world away in the Pacific, the bar became something entirely else, a jungle predator. In the dense, wet chaos of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Peleliu, where visibility was 10 yards at best and ambushes came like lightning, the weapon's combination of raw stopping power and mechanical reliability made it a legend. Mud caked its barrel, rain filled its receiver, and it still fired. Marines carried it on beach assaults, through palm groves, and into bunkers where Japanese defenders waited in silence. At Saipan, Corporal William Red Harmon's bar squad landed under heavy machine gun fire. Pinned behind a sand berm, he crawled forward alone, the gun slung low across his chest. He fired bursts from the hip as he advanced, not the wild spray of Hollywood, but measured, brutal shots that forced the enemy's barrels upward. When his magazines ran dry, his assistant tossed him more, shouting through the roar of the sea. They reached the bunker together, threw grenades, and silenced the position. For actions like these, Harmon and others like him earned the Bronze Star. But every Marine in the line knew the truth. The bar had done the talking. The Japanese, disciplined and ferocious, often launched nighttime counterattacks, screaming banzai as they charged through the dark. The bar's deep report cut through the chaos, its tracer rounds illuminating the charging figures like a flickering hellfire. You could see them fall in the flashes, one Marine remembered. The gun just kept eating. The jungles of the Pacific punished every mechanism, yet the bar rarely quit. Soldiers called it the farmer's gun, because like an old plow, it would still work after rain, rust, or rough handling. Gunners stripped it by feel in the dark, cleaned it with socks and motor oil, and trusted it like a brother. The weapon's endurance became a metaphor for the men who carried it, battered, filthy, exhausted, but still advancing. In every theater, one pattern repeated. The bar turned squads into small, mobile ecosystems of fire and movement. It didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to keep firing long enough to let others breathe. In Normandy, it cracked open hedgerows. In Italy, it reclaimed streets stone by stone. In the Pacific, it burned tunnels clean. By late fall 1944, commanders no longer debated its place. It was the squad's cornerstone, the one weapon that could do everything: suppress, defend, advance, and if needed, hold alone. Its sound became part of the identity of the American infantry. You always knew where the fight was hottest, you listened for the bar, and you ran toward it. That was the doctrine come to life, the walking fire reborn in every man who shouldered the weapon and stepped forward under its roar. The gun didn't just change battles, it changed the way soldiers thought about courage. You didn't need to wait for the artillery or the tanks. You just needed a man with a bar and the will to keep walking.
By the winter of 1944, the Browning automatic rifle had become more than a weapon. It was the psychological backbone of the American infantry squad. Every platoon had at least one, sometimes two. Every man in the squad knew his life depended on the rhythm of that gun. The slow, deep bark of .30-06 bursts echoing through woods or across ruined villages. To the Germans, that sound meant danger was close, that the Americans were still moving, still fighting. To the Americans, it meant one simple thing: we're not alone. The genius of the BAR wasn't only mechanical, it was tactical and emotional. Its presence transformed the behavior of small units. Before its introduction, advancing under fire was an act of desperation. Men sprinted, dropped, and prayed. But with a BAR in the squad, there was a heartbeat, a plan, and a wall of sound. We'd call it the Thunder, recalled Private Henry Godwin of the 4th Infantry Division. When the BAR opened up, you moved. That was the rule. Small unit tactics in Europe revolved around this rhythm. A squad's BAR team, the gunner and his assistant, would suppress the enemy while riflemen maneuvered. Then, once the team advanced, others would take over. The effect was a rolling storm of fire and motion. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it worked. The Germans, who relied on their superb MG-34 and MG-42 teams, had the advantage in sustained fire, yet they lacked the same level of mobility. The MG-42, for all its terrifying speed, was a crew-served weapon. It required a tripod, spare barrels, and constant cooling. The BAR, by contrast, was one man's weapon. He could shoulder it, crawl with it, fire it prone or standing, and move instantly. A German officer captured during the Normandy campaign later admitted that his men were unsettled by how fast American squads could recover from ambushes. He said, "We believed that once we opened with the machine gun, they would stay down. But they never stayed down. There was always one gun, heavy, loud, that answered us at once. That one gun was the BAR." The weapon's psychological impact reached beyond the battlefield's noise. German field manuals began to warn units about American roving fire. Allied squads armed with semi-automatic M1 Garans and 1 or 2 BARs could bring an avalanche of lead at short notice. A single team could pin an entire German platoon if it caught them in the open. The ratio of firepower had shifted. The Americans no longer needed to rely on belt-fed guns or mortars to control space. They could do it with one man. There are dozens of combat accounts illustrating this. One of the most famous comes from the Battle of the Bulge near Bastogne in December 1944. Sergeant James R. Swanson, a BAR gunner in the 101st Airborne Division, was part of a small defense line when German infantry supported by armored cars broke through the tree line. His position had little cover, and their riflemen were running low on ammunition. Swanson crawled forward to a shallow ditch and began firing short bursts, changing magazines with frozen fingers. The heavy thump of the BAR echoed across the snow. He said, "They kept coming, yelling, throwing grenades. I just kept firing until I couldn't feel my hands." When the smoke cleared, the German advance had stalled. They had misinterpreted his single BAR for a full machine gun section. Swanson survived. His barrel was white from heat. That story was repeated in 100 variations, in Normandy's hedgerows, in the mountains of Italy, in the jungles of the Pacific. One man with a BAR could sound like a platoon. In the confusion of battle, perception mattered as much as bullets. The deep, regular bursts of .30-06 created the illusion of multiple guns firing. Enemy soldiers often hesitated, thinking they faced a larger force. That pause, that heartbeat of doubt, gave the Americans time to reposition, reload, or strike. The psychological bond between the BAR gunner and his squad was equally vital. He wasn't just another rifleman, he was the squad's anchor, its moral center. "You could lose a radio, you could lose a jeep," said one veteran of the 2nd Armored Division, "but you never lost your barman. You'd protect him with your life, because he protected you with his." The gunner's job was brutal. The weapon's weight, 20 pounds loaded, and the ammunition burden made him a pack mule under fire. His back was often scorched from the barrel's heat, and his hands calloused from constant reloading. Yet unlike the belt-fed gunners, he had no assistant carrying spare parts or water for cooling. His assistant's only job was to feed him magazines and stay alive long enough to do it. Despite these hardships, morale among barmen remained high. The weapon rewarded discipline and punished recklessness. Fired too long, and you'd cook the barrel. Fired too short, and you'd lose suppression. Experienced gunners developed an instinct,
counting bursts by feel, pacing reloads with muscle memory. You didn't think, you heard the gun and felt when it needed to stop. It was like playing an instrument, a deadly one. The BAR also reshaped the geometry of combat. Before its widespread adoption, most firefights were dominated by the position of fixed machine guns. Once a defensive weapon had a field of fire, attackers either flanked it or died trying. The BAR broke that geometry. It gave the attacking side its own mobile zone of suppression. A squad could generate localized dominance anywhere it went, shifting from defense to offense in seconds. German troops who fought against it reported that American assaults seemed to appear from nowhere, a side effect of BAR-supported mobility. The comparison with the German MG-42, perhaps the most famous machine gun of the war, highlights the brilliance of the BAR. The MG-42 fired twice as fast, but its power came at the cost of flexibility. The BAR was not meant to win duels of volume, it was meant to win duels of movement. When the MG-42 stopped to change barrels or reposition, the BAR man kept crawling forward, firing from the hip or shoulder, forcing the enemy to stay buried. This contrast mirrored two philosophies: the German ideal of efficiency through firepower, and the American belief in initiative through individual control. In battle after battle, this difference shaped outcomes. During the Allied push across France, small skirmishes in villages like Saint-Lô and Mortagne often turned on the presence or absence of a BAR. One sergeant later said, "When the BAR was with you, you didn't think about dying. You thought about moving." That single weapon could alter the psychology of a fight, transforming fear into aggression, paralysis into motion. Even the enemy learned to respect it. A German POW captured near Aachen told his interrogator, "We feared your heavy gun, the one man carries. The rest of your rifles were nothing. But that one," he gestured with his hands, mimicking the recoil, "that one made us stop." By late 1944, the BAR was no longer just part of American doctrine. It was American doctrine distilled into metal. Its purpose had evolved from walking fire to controlled dominance, moving while firing, seizing initiative, dictating the tempo of combat. The gun's mechanical thump wasn't just a sound of war, it was a signal that ordinary soldiers had inherited the power once reserved for heavy crews and static emplacements. The weapon also embodied something deeply human. It was imperfect, temperamental, and heavy, but so were the men who carried it. It rewarded grit more than skill, trust more than theory. And in that way, the BAR became more than an instrument of war. It became a symbol of how individual courage, amplified by smart design, could bend the shape of battle. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the rubble of Cologne, and in the jungles of Okinawa, the sight was always the same. A man crouched behind his gun, firing through the smoke, his face lit by the muzzle flash, his comrades moving in rhythm with the bursts. The walking fire had become something far more powerful. The will to keep advancing while the world tried to push you back.
When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the BAR had earned a reputation no amount of propaganda could manufacture. It was the weapon that had walked with the infantry from the beaches of Normandy to the snows of Bastogne, from the jungles of New Guinea to the streets of Manila. It had been carried by men who were too young to shave, too cold to sleep, and too determined to give up. For them, the Browning automatic rifle was not a relic of an earlier war. It was a brother made of steel. Its voice, that deep, deliberate chug, 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 had become the heartbeat of the American soldier. In the months after the war, captured weapons flowed into Allied and Axis research labs alike. The German engineers who had once dissected the M1911 now turned their attention to the BAR, curious how an automatic rifle so heavy, so mechanically simple, could so consistently outperform their elegant MG teams in mobile warfare. They discovered that the answer was not in rate of fire or raw engineering, but in philosophy. The BAR was designed not to dominate by volume, but by presence.
It placed the power of suppression into the hands of one man, not a crew. It turned squads into living organisms of fire and motion. That idea, the fusion of automatic power and infantry mobility, would redefine post-war doctrine across the world. The U.S. military, meanwhile, emerged from the war with a new vision of the battlefield. The BAR had shown that the individual soldier could control areas once thought possible only for machine guns. But it had also shown the limits of that power. The gun was heavy, its 20-round magazine too small for sustained fire, its barrel unable to handle continuous bursts without overheating. In Europe, where ammunition flowed freely and lines moved fast, these flaws could be tolerated. In the Pacific, and later in Korea, they became critical. So even as the last BAR men were still cleaning their guns in the ashes of World War II, the Ordnance Department was already asking, what comes next? The answer began with imitation. Other nations, inspired or humbled by the BAR's success, sought their own versions. The British experimented with the Bren, the Soviets with the Dig Diarov, and later the RPD, all of which mirrored the idea of a squad-level automatic weapon that one man could carry. But the Americans, characteristically, refused to abandon Browning's creation. Through the late 1940s, the BAR continued to serve as the backbone of U.S. infantry firepower in occupation forces, in Korea, and even into the early years of Vietnam. The weapon's reliability remained legendary. Soldiers joked that the BAR will jam only when the Earth stops spinning. In Korea, the BAR met its second war, a colder, crueler battlefield of mountains, snow, and human waves. There, its slow, deliberate rhythm was a godsend. Chinese and North Korean assaults often came in swarms, and BAR men firing from dugouts or frozen foxholes could cut down waves of attackers before they reached grenade range. The weapon's old problem, overheating, became an advantage in the cold. It was like holding a furnace, wrote Sergeant Walter H. Baker of the 2nd Infantry Division, but that heat kept you alive. In one engagement near Cheopyeong-nu, 2 BAR gunners reportedly held a ridge for nearly 3 hours, their barrels glowing cherry red, until the last magazine ran dry. When reinforcements arrived, they found both men unconscious from exhaustion, but the ridge still held. Technically, the BAR's design philosophy was nearing its end. New ammunition types, lighter materials, and evolving tactics demanded something fresh. In 1957, the U.S. Army officially began replacing it with the M60 machine gun, a belt-fed weapon designed for sustained automatic fire. Yet, in many small units, the BAR refused to vanish. Its reliability, simplicity, and balance were irreplaceable. Marines carried it in jungle patrols during the early stages of Vietnam. National Guard units kept it deep into the 1960s. To many, it was still the only gun that made them feel safe. But perhaps the BAR's true legacy wasn't its continued service, it was what it inspired. Its descendants can be found in every squad automatic weapon, or SAW, that followed. The M60, the M249, the FN Minimi, and countless others carried the same DNA, portable automatic fire at the squad level, a weapon designed not for the machine gun nest, but for the rifleman advancing under fire. That concept that John Browning sketched in 1917, a walking gun, had evolved into a global standard. The modern infantry squad, with its integrated automatic support weapon, owes its structure to the BAR. Yet, beyond the doctrine and design lineage, the BAR left behind something more intangible, a mythology. For the men who carried it, it symbolized responsibility. A BAR man wasn't just another soldier. He was the point of the spear, the steady hand in chaos. You didn't fire unless it mattered, said veteran Jack Morrison of the 90th Infantry Division. When you pulled that trigger, everyone's life around you changed. The gun demanded discipline. It punished panic. It forced courage. And because of that, it forged a bond between man and machine unlike any other weapon of the war. Photographs from the period, muddy helmets, young faces blackened with smoke, a BAR propped on a bipod beside them, became emblems of the American fighting spirit. In newsreels and war documentaries, the distinctive stance of a BAR man, leaning forward into the gun's recoil as tracers cut through darkness, came to define the image of the U.S. infantryman in World War II. Even decades later, Hollywood directors and historians would return to that silhouette, the lone soldier, the steady gun, the courage to advance while the world burned. In museums today, the BAR rests behind glass. Its blued steel, dulled by time, its walnut stock scarred by 1,000 hands. Visitors walk past without hearing what veterans could still hear in their dreams, the rhythmic bursts echoing through hedgerows, across beaches, through frozen forests and tropical nights. Those sounds are the echoes of the walking fire, not a tactic anymore, but a metaphor. It meant never stopping. It meant moving forward while chaos screamed around you. John Browning never lived to see his automatic rifle become a legend. He died in 1926, long before the BAR found its voice in Normandy or the Ardennes. But his philosophy, that technology should serve the courage of ordinary men, lived on in every battle where the weapon was carried. The BAR had not been built to win a war by itself. It had been built to let a soldier keep walking under fire. And that idea, that relentless forward motion in the face of fear, became its immortal legacy. More than 100 years after its creation, armies still teach fire and movement. Squads still train to advance under their own cover. Machine guns still speak in bursts, while men crawl forward through smoke. Every one of those lessons began with a man, a vision, and a rifle that could walk. When a veteran of the 1st Infantry Division was asked what the BAR meant to him, he paused and then smiled. It meant we always had a chance. It meant that no matter what was ahead, we could keep moving. That, more than the medals, the manuals, or the mechanics, was the true gift of the Browning automatic rifle. The walking fire it created was not just a tactic, it was an attitude, a quiet defiance forged in steel that changed how men fought and how they survived. And in every battlefield that came after, that fire never truly died.